Chapter 1 of The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square by Mrs. Henrietta Pasture. Chapter 1. The Lonely Lady. It's delightful to breathe the air breathed by people in Grosvenor Square. Popular song. December in London, 1902. Fog had prevailed throughout the early part of the day. Now it had lifted, but a dismal rain was falling upon the coal-black stems of the lilac, the sooty branches of the plane, and the palings which divided them from the muddy pavement and muddier street. A benevolent, bearded policeman, secure in mackintosh cape, paced slowly and solidly past the windows of 99 Grosvenor Square. Within, a lonely lady sat at luncheon. The table was spread with massive Georgian silver and Crown Derby china, forced lilies of the valley, red roses prematurely called into being, and clinging garlands of smilax, curling in and out of the dessert dishes, added poetry to the prose of wealth's display. The servants were not permitted to wait at luncheon. The lonely lady left the brown chops to simmer over a plated furnace on the sideboard, and only looked at the glazed tongue and frilled ham reposing on beds of glittering aspic jelly. This was not because she lacked appetite, but because she was afraid to broach them. She helped herself timidly to boiled sole and mashed potato. She ate a little maraschino jelly in a furtive and guilty manner, and ended her meal by taking a peach and some crumbs of a fine old Stilton cheese, in the wrong order. She drank first water, stealthily and as though she were doing something wrong, and then, with frightened gulps of triumph, a small glass of light tawny port. When she rose from the table, she rang the bell so gently that the responding tinkle must have been very thin and uncertain, and she walked across the big, solemn dining-room, over the parquet floor of the square hall, past the porter's empty chair, and into the morning-room. Here she sat down, alone as usual. The room was decorated in strict accord with modern taste and convention. The ceiling was heavily encrusted with white ornament, like unto a wedding cake. Panels of green brocade bore old gilt candelabra on the walls. The narrow Adam's mantelshelf held Louis XVI candlesticks, a Dresden clock, and Sèvres vases, beneath the life-size Romney portrait which occupied the space usually assigned to a mirror. The fender rose in wild ornament of mimic flames made in solid gilt metal around the white tiled fireplace. The moss-green carpet bore heavy impress of a suite of Louis XVI furniture, gilt and brocaded. Hothouse palms, rose-wreathed hangings, and the curved legs of enamelled tables lent graceful lines to pleasant spaces. Silver vases bore fragrant burdens of curled chrysanthemums, golden and bronze. A malachite pillar supported a tree fern, and masses of azalea, pearl-petalled and scarlet-stained, bloomed in unnatural profusion in a shady corner, so quickly drooping, so easily renewed, because the owner of the house in Grosvenor Square was very rich and had a great love for flowers. The lonely lady had nothing to do with the decoration of the room, and flowers which disdained times and seasons, and bloomed for gold alone, bewildered as much as they pleased her. She sat on the sofa and looked at them, rose and walked to the window, and looked at the rain and the promenading policeman, returned to the sofa and looked at the little empty idle hands in her lap. She would gladly have taken down one of the volumes, bound in morocco and bright with gold tooling, from the shelves behind the glass doors of the Chippendale bookcases, which lurked in the alcoves on either side of the fireplace. But, alas, She had tried the doors and found them securely locked. Upon the low occasional table by the side of the rose-wreathed couch lay a copy of the Book of Beauty, published in the early 40s. It opened of itself at a steel engraving of the portrait of Miss Marnie of Orsett, and represented a young lady seated upon a balcony beside a marble pillar, playing the harp. Miss Marnie wore a flowing muslin gown looped with roses. Ringlets depended on either side of a handsome face, archly smiling over a bare shoulder. Her gloves, lace handkerchief, and a stiff little bouquet were carefully disposed in the foreground. The lonely lady had looked at the picture many times already, and read the verses facing it, which began, "Fair girl, and hast thou left the festive scene, to warble as a nightingale without the noble halls of thine ancestral home, where thou art queen of frolic, dance, and rout?" But she read them again with a momentary renewal of interest before she put the book back in its accustomed place. The crackling of the fire within the room, and the distant clip-clop and jingle of hansoms outside, broke the silence. There was straw laid down in the street beneath the windows, because the owner of the house was ill. The lonely lady looked up at the Romney portrait and sighed childishly, "I wish you could speak to me." Her name was Jeanne Marie Charlotte de Courcy, but the gilt plate on the frame of the Romney portrait bore the name of her English great-grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Marnie, R.E., of Orsett Hall, near Bath, born 1771, died 1851. The portrait must have been painted when Harry Marnie was about 20 years old. He wore a grey powdered wig ending in a pigtail, a red coat with black velvet revers and gold epaulettes, a waistcoat and knee breeches of white satin, and a snowy neckcloth. The scene represented a battlefield, and the young face, oval and delicate as a woman's, stood boldly out against a background of lowering clouds and grey smoke. Straight black brows met above dark blue eyes and an aquiline nose. A firmly closed mouth with slightly upturned corners gave a stern, almost satirical expression to the proud, handsome face. "It's no use looking so brave and so scornful," said Jeanne. "You know you were never in a battle in all your long life." Then she relented and apologised. "But I dare say you would have been if you could, for you are very like Louis. So like that it almost makes me cry to look at you, great-grandpapa Harry. I suppose promotion was very quick in your time for gentlemen of fortune, or perhaps the inscription was put a long time after the picture was painted. Surely you could not have been a colonel at that age. Must ask Aunt Caroline." The only surviving daughter of Colonel Harry lay upstairs on her sick bed. She was now 80 years old, as the original of the portrait had been when death had summoned him from the hunting field to take his place in the family vault. Jeanne had been nearly 3 weeks in the house of her great aunt, but it seemed to her almost as though as many years must have elapsed since she had left the farm on the borders of Wales, where she and her twin brother Louis had been brought up. She was used to loneliness. Coed Ithel lay among the mountains, more than 2 miles from the nearest village, and the roads were bad and distances great for travellers to town and market. The homestead belonged to her bachelor uncle, a hard-working farmer who was generally out of doors, and who mostly fell asleep if forced, from any cause, to remain within, so that his niece could scarcely look to him for companionship, even if he had been as congenial to her as he was kind. She had not seen her brother Louis, who was now in South Africa, since he had left home to join his regiment in India nearly 5 years ago. Thus she had grown accustomed to a certain solitude, but the loneliness of the hillside is not the loneliness of a large house in the midst of a crowd of strangers. A restless impatience of the conditions which surrounded her began to pervade her empty days and her wakeful nights. She was 25 years old, but in consequence of her forlornness and the roundness of her little face, she looked much younger. Her sojourn in town had not yet succeeded in dimming the beautiful red bloom which the air of her native mountains had lent her complexion. The clear blue whites of her soft brown eyes, fringed with long black lashes, betrayed the perfect healthfulness of their owner. Dimples lurked on the round chin and in the round young cheeks, but there was no smile to bring them forth from their hiding places. The corners of the pretty mouth drooped, and expressed as much sadness as such a childish face could hold. Jeanne had seen her aunt but once during the last 3 weeks. Upon the day of her arrival she had been sent for to Miss Mamey's own apartment, to which that lady had been confined by illness for some time past, although she had not then yet taken to her bed. Her first view of Miss Caroline presented to her a tall and dignified figure, erect in an elbow chair, and clad in a flowing gown of grey satin, with flounces of Honiton lace, upon which couch of luxury her favourite dog, a little Yorkshire terrier, was very calmly reposing. A lace cap, with pale pink velvet bows, crowned Miss Caroline's white hair, parted above black brows which met across a hawk nose, and blue eyes still piercing, still blackly fringed. Jeanne had trembled not a little before this stately apparition, and her obvious alarm and admiration had impressed her grand aunt favourably. But of the interview she had but a vague recollection, for between terror and fatigue she could scarce bring herself to answer the few formal questions put to her concerning her journey. Miss Mamey would hardly have permitted an earthquake, far less the arrival of a humble stranger niece, to derange one of the established customs of her regular existence. It was the hour for double dummy, and Jeanne was therefore requested to establish herself in an armchair in the background, and given a prolonged opportunity for recovering her composure during her aunt's nightly recreation of card-playing. As the clock struck 9, Mrs. Pyke, the housekeeper, entered, dressed in black brochet, which was curiously patterned with violet flowers in accordance with an ancient fashion. Also, she wore a black lace cap upon her head, and a long gold watch chain about her neck. The maid, Dunham, had already set forth the card table, and Mrs. Pyke, pausing in the doorway to make a curtsy, glided decorously into her place, and gathered the cards into slightly palsied hands, veiled by black mittens. Pyke had entered her 90th year, but it had not yet occurred to her that she was too old to fulfil her duties. She was a strangely silent person, and her length of service did not inspire her to abate one iota of her perpetual awe-struck deference to her employer, though nothing could have exceeded Miss Mamey's graciousness to her oldest dependant. The rubber had been played in silence, Jeanne scarcely daring to breathe. She noted with wonder and delight the magnificence of her grand aunt's appearance and the stateliness of her bearing. She had indeed never seen any one like her. Every time Miss Mamey tossed her head, and this was a favourite gesture oft repeated, Jeanne thrilled responsively. She practised the movement afterwards before her looking-glass in private, and was disgusted at her own inability to produce double chins in rapid succession. The scene interested her deeply. The card table, lighted with green shaded candles, struck her with pleasant dismay. Her nonconformist uncle at Coed Ithel called cards the devil's books, and she had never seen this class of literature before. She felt almost as guilty as though she were being called upon to assist at a witch's orgy, instead of an old lady's innocent rubber, as she watched the housekeeper's shrivelled black figure and dim spectacled eyes peering at the cards held in her mittened hands. She observed with interest the small sour smile on Mrs. Pyke's sunken mouth when her mistress condescended to put an ace on her king, and heard her faint clack of apology when she secured the odd trick for herself, Jeanne wondered why both the old servants affected violet as their only decoration, and came to the conclusion that it must be because they thought it the most respectful colour for servants to wear, next to unrelieved black. Dunham, another silent witness of the game, had been interested only in the flush on Miss Mamey's face, and the stertorous difficult breathing which was painfully audible in the heavily curtained double-windowed room. The rubber was cut short by some astounding coups and a timely revoke on the part of Mrs. Pyke, in deference to private signals from Dunham, who was seated a little behind her mistress. When it was over, another time-honoured ceremony was gone through. A glass of Madeira was poured out very solemnly and presented to the aged housekeeper, as a recompense and refreshment after her labours. Pyke received this mark of favour with perennial surprise and gratitude, venturing to express a humble wish for Miss Mamey's good health before she swallowed the wine, and making a second curtsy before she retired finally from the apartment. Jeanne, too, had been dismissed, but with a gracious smile, an intimation that she should in future address her relative as Aunt Caroline rather than as Aunt Marnie, and a promise that an early interview should be accorded in the morning. During the night, however, a great bustle and commotion arose in the old house, of which little Jeanne, sleeping soundly after her journey and forgotten by the terrified domestics, knew nothing. She learnt next day that her grand aunt was very ill, and that she had had some kind of a stroke or seizure. Dunham was reticent concerning details, but she explained that Jeanne must not go to Miss Mamey's room unless she was sent for, and Jeanne, unaccustomed to independent action of any kind, for she had always been subject to authority, had acquiesced as a matter of course. During the weeks that followed, she had moped, unquiet, alone, and disconsolate, poring over the newspapers for hours, rather in hopes of finding her brother's name in the South African intelligence than because she was particularly interested in the general news of the day, afraid of venturing forth alone into the unfamiliar streets, choked by the fog, depressed by the weather, and hourly expectant of the summons to her aunt's bedside. The long afternoon wore away, and at 4:30 the tea was brought in by Hewitt the butler and William the Irish footman. William was still a footman, though 40 summers had passed lightly over his carroty head and freckled face, for his twinkling eyes, snub nose, and wide smiling mouth belied all his efforts to emulate the serious dignity of his superior, and debarred him for ever from rising to the first rank in his profession. A little animation came into the lonely lady's woebegone face when the servants withdrew, leaving her respectfully alone to enjoy her meal. She enjoyed it less because she was hungry than because eating and drinking gave her something to do. To farm-bred Jeanne, the tea, however dainty, appeared but the contemptible shadow of her favourite repast, though, since she had taken next to no exercise for some days past, and had lunched but 2 hours earlier, a less healthy appetite would scarcely have needed it at all. She handled the heavy Georgian urn nervously, made the tea, and poured it into a shallow cup of eggshell china. She spurned the London cream, delicately flavoured with boracic acid, and haughtily left one of the 4 minute wafers which did duty for bread and butter on its snowy folded napkin, lest Hewitt and William should be led to suppose her accustomed to more solid fare. It was a greater effort of self-denial to spare the 3rd sponge cake. Miss Mamey's still-room maid made excellent sponge cakes, though they were shaped and sized rather to suit dolls than human beings with a taste for sweet things. Spin it out as she would, the meal was over in the space of 1/4 of an hour, and when the door opened presently, Jeanne thought the servants had come to clear away the tea things. She did not turn her head from the window, still blurred with rain, to which she had returned, but stood there, looking out dismally at the rows of twinkling lights in perspective, reflected in the wet mud of the street, until they were lost in grey mist and smoke. The sound of a throat cleared, respectfully but unmistakably in readiness for speaking, made her start, and she beheld her aunt's maid standing at her elbow. The old-fashioned waiting-woman, who was scarce 10 years younger than her mistress, and had tended Miss Mamey faithfully for upwards of half a century, addressed Jeanne kindly but stiffly, and somewhat as though she were speaking to a very little child. "Your auntie is asking for you, missy." "For me? At last! Will she really see me again? I will come at once," said Jeanne very joyfully. The ennui vanished, and the dimples appeared. "Then she must be better. Is she better, Mrs. Dunham, do you think?" Dunham shook her head. Down her wrinkled face stole the slow tears of age, falling unheeded, one after another, onto her black silk bodice and violet silk apron. A certain independence of character, joined to great industry and a respectful manner, had recommended Dunham to her mistress from their earliest acquaintance. They quarrelled just sufficiently often, and Dunham was just sufficiently outspoken to enliven their daily intercourse, but the maid was tactful as well as frank, and knew exactly how far she might go. Now that her lady lay dying, Dunham felt very desolate. Her interests outside the little world of Miss Mamey's household had lessened with the passing of years almost to vanishing point. The thought of change chilled and saddened her. She would have been shocked indeed had any one accused her of wishing to die before her time, but yet, had she been given any choice in the matter by Providence, it is probable that she would have chosen to accompany Miss Mamey on the journey which lay before her now, as she had accompanied her on shorter journeys during the past 50 years of her existence. Jeanne's pretty face reflected the maid's sadness. Her heart was tender, and her impulses were quick and warm, though perhaps not always as wise as they were kind. She would have embraced and consoled the old woman had she dared, but the distance between them seemed too awful to be thus bridged over by an impulse, and Dunham looked too inscrutably respectful and dignified to be embraced by any one, far less by so young and insignificant a stranger as Jeanne felt herself to be. Wherefore she followed her guide meekly and silently up the winding stone staircase of the old house to the second floor. She felt both frightened and pitiful, for Dunham's expression betrayed that she believed her mistress to be on the point of death. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square by Mrs. Henry de la Pasture. Chapter 2. The Pedigree. Miss Mamey's aquiline nose and blue eyes were visible over the edge of the sheet as Jeanne entered the bedroom. A nightcap was tied with pink ribbons under her ample chin, and a hand with a white kid glove on it caressed her little growling Yorkshire terrier, which was curled upon the quilt. All her life Miss Caroline had prided herself upon the beauty of her hands, and they were exquisite yet, though seldom visible, for she was busy preserving them still. "Would you like the candles, ma'am? Or the light turned on?" said Dunham, advancing to the bed. "No, there is a good fire. The room is light enough. One can talk better by firelight," said Miss Mamey, in a tone so brisk that it made Jeanne jump. She had expected to find her aunt in a semi-moribund condition, and was no less astonished than relieved to find her in such cheerful wise, and so well able to speak naturally and give orders as usual. She decided that Dunham must have taken an unnecessarily gloomy view of the situation. "Don't fidget about, Dunham," said the invalid imperiously, "but go out of the room and shut the door after you. I want to make acquaintance with my grandniece. You won't tire yourself, ma'am? When I feel tired, Miss Jane will ring." Dunham turned a warning face towards Jean before leaving the room, and Jean nodded acquiescence and encouragement. The door was shut, and she found herself alone with her great aunt. "I like to see your fresh face, my love," said Miss Caroline graciously. "You have the Marnie complexion. When I was young, the reddest rose could not vie with my colour. There is no such thing as a complexion nowadays. Young women are all pasty-faced." Jean's confidence was restored by this complimentary address. Though she was alarmed by the butler and footman, and even rather fearful of Dunham and Mrs. Pyke, she became at once easy and natural in the presence of her august relative, for like many ultra-sensitive persons she alternated between the extremes of courage and timidity. "You are neither thin nor sallow," said Miss Mamey. "No one, in fact, could believe you had a drop of French blood in your veins, and yet undeniably there it is." Her voice was surprised and rather triumphant, as though she were under the impression that French blood must be yellow rather than red, and of a necessarily inferior quality. "You are not in the least like your father." "But it is a great disappointment to Louis and me," said Jean, unconscious of her aunt's prejudices, "that we are not like our French ancestors. We sigh over it every time we look at the miniatures which belong to poor papa." "Have you those miniatures still?" "Why, they are our greatest treasures," said Jean, surprised in her turn. "Louis said I must never let them out of my sight, so I brought them to London with me. We are very, very proud to belong to them, but we know we are not like them. However, I mind less now that I know who Louis is like. Does your twin brother not resemble you?" "Not a bit," said Jean, and she winked away a tear at the mere mention of her brother, after the weeks of silence she had unwillingly endured. "It is the portrait over the mantelpiece in the morning room that Louis is like. He is so like that it might just as well be his portrait." "Like the Romney picture of my father?" said Miss Mamey rather sharply. She drew herself up eagerly on her pillows, and the gloved hand that settled the pink bow of her nightcap trembled nervously. "How very extraordinary. Your father was not like our family, and your mother was a farmer's daughter with, as I have always heard, no great pretensions to looks." "Just a little round thing like me," said Jean, humbly enough. "Yet their son resembles his great-grandfather? I find it difficult to believe that the likeness can be anything very striking, my love. I should like to judge for myself." "He will be coming home very soon, I hope," said Jean. Miss Mamey moved uneasily, and the thought crossed Jean's mind that perhaps even the "very soon" might be too late for her aunt. "Perhaps you have a photograph," said Miss Mamey. "Of course. How stupid of me. It was taken 5 years ago, so he may be changed. But he was 20. And I suppose the young man in the picture — I beg your pardon," said Jean, confused. "I mean my great-grandfather must have been the same age when that was painted." She unfastened the bodice of her plain serge frock, and took a common silver locket from its little white nest next her heart. This she produced very simply and handed to her aunt. Miss Mamey groped for her spectacle case beneath the pillow, and adjusted the glasses on the high bridge of her hawk nose. Then she pressed an electric button in a knob beside her, and by the light of a tiny glass globe above the bed, stared for some moments at the photograph. An ever-increasing interest and pleasure were expressed upon her good-looking old face. "My dear, you are quite right. He is remarkably like. Remarkably like. What an instance of the freaks of heredity. The son of Louis de Courset, whose foreign appearance we deplored, and of a farmer's daughter with no appearance at all, and he grows up the living image of my beloved father, who was one of the finest looking men of his day. Pray, how tall is he?" 6'2" in his stockings," said Jean proudly. "He is very strong and athletic, Aunt Caroline, and has won silver cups — I have them at home — for running and jumping. And think how well he has done for himself in the army. Poor boy, with no interest, and only his own brains to help him along." "Looks are of quite as much assistance as brains, my dear Jane," said Miss Mamey, "and he owes his looks to us." She seemed soothed and gratified by this reflection. "Your brother is very handsome, my love. He is a true Mamey. I should like to keep this photograph." Jeanne's brown eyes grew round with dismay. "I could not sleep without the locket in my hand," she faltered. "It was his parting present, Aunt Caroline." Then she was shocked at her own selfishness. Who was she to be refusing what might prove to be, perhaps, the last request of her dying relative? Though the pink bows on the nightcap and the liveliness of Miss Caroline's blue eyes looked very little like dying to Jeanne. "Keep it as long as you like," she gasped, and closed the gloved fingers gently over her treasure. "If it is any comfort to you to have it, if it reminds you of your father, I could not grudge it to you. After all," she choked back a sob, "I do not need anything to remind me of Louis really. He is here, in my heart." She clasped her little hands tragically upon her round young breast. "I think of him always, day and night." "You shall have it back soon," said Miss Mamey. The simplicity of her niece pleased her. She was impulsive herself and generous, though many years of complete independence and great wealth had caused her to become likewise capricious and self-indulgent. "I see you mean to be kind to me," she said, with amused graciousness, "and I mean to be kind to you. Now tell me, what do you think of the house?" "I think it is very beautiful inside, and filled with beautiful things," said Jeanne sincerely. "You have not, of course, seen the saloons? I keep them covered up. The tapestry chairs there were all worked in the 18th century, and are very exquisite. I keep the pictures covered up too. I believe they would suffer from the London blacks, to which I cannot accustom myself even after 20 years' experience. And I will not risk the family collection. Some day I will show it to you. I have added to it myself as regularly as I was able." "I should like to see it," said Jeanne. "But I had the morning room made ready for you to sit in. I am very partial to that room. It is done up according to modern taste, for though I am so old, I pride myself upon not falling behind the times," said Miss Mamey, bridling. "I sit there always, and I hope you like it, my love." "I like it very much indeed," said Jeanne, and she sighed unconsciously. "Are you always alone, Aunt Caroline?" "I am almost entirely alone, my love. I do not care to make new friends, and I have outlived most of my old ones. Those who survive are down in the West Country, and correspondence is not my forte. I drive out a good deal. I hope you order the carriage when you require it." "Thank you very much," stammered Jeanne, "but I quite so, my love. The fogs have been rather bad, I understand, but you will feel inclined to go and see your friends as the weather improves?" "I know only one person. I scarcely know if she is a friend still, in London," said scrupulous Jeanne. "You are young, my love, and will find more friends, and later on you will have plenty of visits to make, I have no doubt. But you are quite right to be exclusive," said her aunt. "I do not care to be hail fellow well met myself with everybody I see. We must try and amuse each other, for the hours seem very long to me lying here." "And they seem very long to me downstairs," sighed Jeanne, "for I do not like to talk to the servants, even if they seemed inclined, which they don't." "I should think not, my love. It would not do at all. Never encourage familiarity. But have you nothing to do? You should never sit idle. It is a bad habit for a young person. Have you not even brought your tatting?" said Miss Mamey solicitously. Jeanne knew not what tatting might be, but she shook her head, for whatever it was, she had certainly not brought it. "I brought nothing but absolute necessaries. I did not know how long I was to stay. Uncle Roberts said I was to go at once when your telegram came. So I started as soon as the cart could be got ready, and brought as few things as possible. Just a small box, and my desk in my hand." "You must be sadly uncomfortable, my love," said Miss Caroline sympathetically. "Still it will give you some shopping to do. Pray hand me the bag on my quilt." Jeanne attempted to do so, but the little terrier growled ominously. "Sensible dog," said Miss Mamey in approving tones. "You see how he guards my property." But she quieted her pet, and the bag was extricated. Miss Caroline opened it without removing the white kid glove, and took out a bundle of crackling bank notes. Selecting a couple, she handed them to Jeanne. "You must get yourself any trifle you require, my dear Jane. No thanks, I beg. Put them in the pocket of your gown. And pray write and desire that your wardrobe may be sent. I am in hopes of persuading you to stay on." Jeanne's heart sank, but she tried to conceal her dismay as well as she could, and faltered forth her thanks for her relative's proposed hospitality. "I am desirous to know," said Miss Mamey, settling herself among her pillows, and half closing her eyes, "how far you are aware of your near connection with our family. I am too weak to be able to talk much myself, but I can give you my attention very well." Her accents were regretful, and Jeanne divined that Miss Caroline was more accustomed to hold forth herself than to listen to others. "Speak clearly, my love. People nowadays mumble so dreadfully." Without suspecting her aunt of deafness, Jeanne obediently raised her voice. "I know more about our own family than about yours, but Uncle Roberts has told me what he has heard of both. Then there are the labels on the miniatures, and an odd volume of a kind of old French history of the ancienne noblesse, containing an account of the de Coursets. It brings down the pedigree as far as my great-grandfather." "Ah," said Miss Mamey dryly. "There were 2 brothers and a sister, Pierre, Charles, and Anne-Marie. Our great-grandfather was Pierre, the Marquis de Courset. He was page to Madame Royale, the daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He escaped with his young wife during the Revolution in 1793, and came to England, and gave drawing lessons in Bath to support them both. But he had been an officer in the French cavalry, and couldn't be happy without soldiering. So he left his wife and their little son Henri, and joined the campaign of the French princes in Germany, and was killed. But he desired that his son should be brought up as an Englishman." "Quite right. I know all this, and as you may suppose it is not very interesting to me, but it must be got through before we come to our family," said Miss Mamey, tossing her head among the pillows. "Would you rather I stopped?" Jeanne said, somewhat discouraged by this reception of her enthusiastic recital of a history which was to her the most interesting and romantic in the world. "No, my love, I am equally struck with the retentiveness of your memory and your respect for the past. Pray continue." "The brother of the Marquis, my great-granduncle Charles, was in the French Navy," said Jeanne, "and served on board the Calypso at Martinique, a battleship which remained faithful to the royal cause throughout the Revolution. Louis XVIII made him a Chevalier of St. Louis and of the Legion of Honour, and that is all the book says about him. I don't know if he married and had children. Anyway, he did not emigrate, he stayed in France." "I never heard of him, but a Frenchman is a Frenchman," said Miss Mamey, sternly and incontrovertibly. "The little sister, the Comtesse Anne-Marie," said Jeanne, yet more disconcerted, "was a Chanoinesse, but we do not know exactly what that means. She is the one we like best. She was the first noble lady to be arrested in the Revolution, and she was imprisoned in the citadel of Calais during the Terror, and died there. She looks so gay and beautiful and disdainful, and has a mouth like a Cupid's bow." "Ladies in miniatures always have that kind of mouth, my love," said Miss Mamey. "Her fate was very shocking. But we will return to the little son Henry. He was left in Bath under the care of his widowed mother, who, most fortunately for herself, eventually married an English gentleman." "But it wasn't very faithful of her," said Jeanne indignantly. "Possibly not, my love. Foreigners are more apt, I believe, to be frivolous than faithful. Still, She married an English esquire of fortune and repute, who was a true father to Henry, and sent him to Eton and put him into a cavalry regiment. He grew up quite English, though he was called the Count de Courset. Yes, said Jeanne, trying to keep the sound of regret out of her voice. He was a colonel in the 29th Hussars when we made his acquaintance, said Miss Mamey, who now took up the recital with much energy in spite of her weakness. He became a lieutenant general and married my dear sister Jane, who died in childbirth in 1851. Poor Henry fell before Sebastopol in 55, and my brother and I adopted their little Louis. That was my father, said Jeanne. I can hardly expect you to realise, my love, in the light of after events, how devotedly attached we were to the orphan son of our gentle beloved Jane. But Louis was not, unhappily, a true Marnie. His foreign blood was a distress to us both, and his disposition, alas, though attractive to some people, too clearly denoted his French origin. His character was not congenial to my dear brother, a very grave and serious man. Louis had a happy nature, light-hearted, facile, but in short, the exact opposite of your poor uncle. Louis le debonair, I used to call him, fondly and playfully. She sighed. I overindulged him, my love, for it seemed to me as though Providence had bestowed him upon us. My dear brother designed him for his heir, being himself a great invalid and unlikely to marry. We planned that Louis should assume his mother's name and become one day Marnie of Orsett. And you cast him off because he married my mother, said Jeanne, holding her head very high in spite of her timidity. My dear Jane, I cannot discuss your father's conduct with you, said Miss Mamey with great dignity. It would be neither charitable nor seemly. When I tell you that all our hopes were centred in him, you must imagine for yourself, as well as you can, that we did not lightly decide to abandon them for ever. It pleased God, Miss Caroline's voice shook, but her sunken blue eyes gleamed brightly, that he should atone by a gallant death for many errors of youth. They have all died like that, the de Coursets. It is the family tradition, said Jeanne, with a throb of pride. But, oh, how frightened that made me for Louis all through the Boer War. And he was never even wounded, after all. It also pleased God, said Miss Mamey, that the last of the Marnies of Orsett should be just an old brother and sister living together and alone, pursued by misfortune, as you must know. Jeanne had heard of the great fire which had destroyed Orsett Hall, and she nodded sympathetically. I know you lost your home, she said softly. And my brother, said Miss Mamey. He was not an old man, but he never recovered the shock. He would not face the rebuilding of Orsett, so we came to London. I had always desired to live in London. Thus sorrowfully was my wish attained, too late to give me any pleasure. We bought this house from a distant cousin, the Duke of Monaghan, and here we settled with the salvage of our home, and here my brother died. She wiped away a tear, but it seemed rather an involuntary tribute to her brother's memory than the outcome of any agitation, for her voice was quite calm. Fortunately, we had saved most of the family treasures, the pictures, which are very valuable, the library, the plate, and some of the furniture. My love, I hope these things will always be cared for as I have cared for them. I have guarded them as the apple of my eye, said Miss Mamey very earnestly. During the last 20 years, the care of them has been my only solace. I have had the pictures cleaned and restored by degrees under my own supervision, and a catalogue raisonné made of the books. They have supplied the place of friends and acquaintances, being so very full of memories and associations for me. I was too old when I came here, my love, to begin a fresh life, but you are young. You will call upon people later on, and they will be glad to see you. There was a pause. You are wondering, said Miss Mamey shrewdly, why, when your father was killed in Afghanistan, we did not send for you and your twin brother 20 years ago. I have been wondering ever since I came here, said Jeanne frankly. My brother had the strongest possible feelings against such mésalliances as the one your father chose to contract. It was utterly repugnant to him. His indulgence was already exhausted by your poor father's extravagance and other matters into which I cannot enter with you. And he warned Louis that if he married this young woman, he would henceforth be a stranger to him and to his children after him. He kept his word, as a Marnie naturally would, said Miss Caroline with excessive haughtiness. He never, in fact, wavered for a moment. He told me he hoped I should never waver, but he extracted no promise. She hesitated. Your brother is very dear to you, Jean? He is everything in the world to me, said Jean. Her brown eyes glistened in the firelight, which now illumined the room somewhat less brightly. Then you will understand that his wishes were the more sacred when he was no longer with me. Then why? I am coming to that. The actions of human beings, said Miss Mamey solemnly, are not always guided by principle. More often, perhaps, especially in our family, by impulse, prejudice, or sentiment. Let me get my dear dog safe and snug, or he is such an intelligent animal that he will assuredly bite you. Now you may look in the pocket of my bag. Don't fumble anything else, and you will find a little letter in a fancy envelope. It was written to me when your father was at a preparatory school, the first time he ever left home. The firelight flickered over the mahogany furniture, on the polished glass top of the dressing table, laden with crystal and gold, on the medicine bottles by the bedside, and on the little brown head of Jean, stooping by the brass fender over the dim writing on the small yellow sheet. Miss Caroline Mamey lay still among the pillows of her four-poster bed, apparently considering the ornamentation of the ceiling, as she caressed mechanically her sleeping lapdog, twining the gloved taper fingers among its silvery grey curls. She had come very nearly to the end of her life's journey, and doubtless her thoughts travelled a long way back on the road, bridging space, and lingering among those flowery tracks of youth, which seem always so fair to the onlooker, with a beauty which the little pilgrim straying therein seldom recognises until he has left them far behind. Jean read the letter. Slough, Windsor, January, 1858. My dear Auntie, I am writing as you bid me, but it is very difficult to writ here. I hope soon it will be time for me to leave here and go to Eton. I am not at all homesick as you feared I would be. I hope it will soon be the holidays. I wish I had been a better boy to Uncle Philip, and then I need not have come to school yet. There is one boy here younger than me, so I am not the youngest. I send everybody at Orsett my love, and please, please tell Uncle Philip I feel very sorry indeed now to have been so bad. I dare say I shall bring home some prizes. It is not 3 months to the holidays. Please feed my guinea pigs. My dearest darling Auntie, you need not be afraid I will forget you at school. Remember that wherever I am I will always love you, even when you are quite old. Your affe and dutiful nephew, Louis de Courset. I thought I had destroyed all his letters, said Miss Caroline's voice from the bed, but I found that one the other day, just before my illness, when I was turning out an old desk. If you ask me, Jane, why, after all, I sent for you, that is the only reason I can give you. You are not afraid? Jean's voice faltered, and she looked rather fearfully round the shadowy corners of the large, luxurious room. You are not afraid that your poor brother would be angry with you? I am so close to him now, said Miss Mamey's voice in the darkness, that I know he is not. End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ruhi Haq. The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square by Mrs. Henry de la Pasture. Chapter 3 The Miniatures. The lonely lady went downstairs to her own bedroom after this conversation, not a little cheered and comforted by the first real intercourse she had had with a human being since her arrival in Grosvenor Square. Her bedroom was on the first floor, a strangely solitary apartment whereof the isolation inspired her with much nightly terror. A suite of cold white drawing rooms had been turned into a series of picture galleries, and though the walls were crowded with pictures, these were carefully veiled from view, and the scanty furniture, dotted about the ocean of polished parquet, was muffled in holland covers, so that the saloons presented a very comfortless and ghostly appearance. The empty music room beyond had no furniture at all save a grand piano and two shrouded chairs. The great mahogany folding doors of this apartment opened upon the landing of a secondary staircase, and across this landing, in a cul-de-sac, was the spare room which had been assigned to Jean. It had not occurred to Miss Mamey that her niece might be nervous. She had herself no experience of night fears. She occupied the best bedroom on the second floor, and Dunham slept in the communicating apartment on the right, whilst old Mrs. Pyke inhabited the dressing room beyond the bathroom on her left. Moreover, a handbell stood by her side, and the knob of an electric bell was nightly placed beneath her pillow, so that she might be able to summon assistance in a moment, should a burglar appear, as Dunham constantly apprehended he would. Jean had a bell in her room, but she had no idea whether anyone would hear it if she rang it after the household had retired, and being besides unaccustomed to the convenience of bells, the sight of it brought her little comfort. She suffered great agonies of nightly terrors, thinking of the silent ghostly suite of rooms beyond her own, or listening to the unaccustomed noises of the streets, with the knowledge that no one else was sleeping on the same floor, and that the servants' quarters were carefully shut off by green baize doors at the end of the long passage. But to-day she felt less lonely, because the sounds overhead no longer spoke to her of mystery and suffering. She could picture her aunt's face on the pillow, with the pink bows tied under her chin, and Mrs. Dunham moving about, making up the fire, and ministering to her various needs. Coming freshly from the perusal of that letter, penned half a century ago by a miserable little homesick schoolboy, it was natural that Jean should go straight to the shabby desk which contained his despised family records, consisting of one worn old blue leather volume stamped faintly with the fleur-de-lis, and 5 miniatures. From this little stock of treasures she drew first her father's portrait. It was a very bad little painting, and perhaps her long enforced study of the Romney picture in the morning room helped to open her eyes to its deficiencies. She laid it down with a sigh, and lifted the triple frame which contained the 3 French miniatures of her great-grandfather and his brother and sister in their premiere jeunesse. The young Marquis wore a wig of powdered curls depending on either side of a full, sensuous face, with a high nose, thick dark eyebrows, merry brown eyes, and a pronounced dimpled chin. The feature most attractive and individual was the mouth, beautifully shaped, and redder even than the crimson drapery held by a white hand, in most artificial pose, around a loosely open shirt of frilled lawn and an unbuttoned surtout. Charles, the naval officer, was cast in a sterner and plainer mould, but Anne-Marie resembled her elder brother. There was no trace of the religieuse in this miniature, which represented a young girl with raven tresses and flowered headdress, piled above arched brows and hazel eyes and simpering cherry bow-shaped lips. It was strange to look upon the picture and read the record in the shabby book of her dignified, heroic acceptance of imprisonment, of her lonely death in the citadel of Calais, the first woman of her order to suffer arrest, and victim most innocent of the Revolution. The 5th miniature was in a locket, and represented her grandfather Henry as he had been when he married Miss Jane Mamey of Worcester. Doubtless the medallion was a wedding present and had been worn upon the bride's heart, for a lock of the gallant Colonel's grey hair was enclosed in the crystal back, and on the rim was engraved in minute letters, Henry Charles Louis, Marquis et Comte de Courset, etc., etc., Colonel 29th Hussars. Jean's father bore only his name. The French title had evidently been discarded by his mother's family. The boy who was destined to become Marny of Orsett could afford to ignore such empty and barren honours. Perhaps the gentle Jane had been less scornful, Jean thought. Louise and Jean had built many a fairy castle of hope and romance in their childhood, all founded upon this wonderful French ancestry, which Miss Mamey regarded so contemptuously. Louis was burning with ambition, and fertile in imagination, and his bold fancy embraced many a scheme for the restoration of the French monarchy and his own consequent aggrandizement. His hopes were for himself, Jean's were for him, but her sympathy and ardour were not the less warm on this account, and her dreams continued long after this had been quenched in the realities of an active life. Their honest, prosaic Welsh uncle had no idea of the secret aspiration of the twins' early youth, nor was his respect for French blood and breeding any higher than Miss Mamey's own. Louis and Jean, who were called Louis and Jane at Coed Hell, ascribed his contempt to ignorance, and learned to smile inwardly when he expressed his views on the subject. "Poor sister Jenny," said the farmer, alluding to their dead mother with indulgent pity, "so much to do about her grand marriage, and, willy-nilly, she must have him against the wishes of his family, and what did my fine gentleman do for her after all? Lost her a good situation in Bath, and sent her here with his pedigree in her pocket, and never a brass farthing to keep it company. A pedigree be good for stock, but it never made human beings any more worth that I ever heard of. Poor Jenny had a hankering after the gentry more than ever I could understand. But there it is. She was church, and I was chapel, so to speak, and her children shall be what she was, as is but right and natural. Still she came to be glad, pension or no pension, that her boy should be brought up on a good honest farm. I don't grudge him a good education, though. He's a gentleman's son, and I can afford to pay for un. Take it and welcome, says I." Louis took the best he could get. The rector of the parish was friendly with the headmaster of the grammar school in the nearest large market town, and interested him in the history of the twins, while Louis was yet a little boy. The child's lively intelligence, precocity, and good looks did the rest. In time, Louis won scholarships as well as the approval and affection of his master, and he delighted his uncle by retaining his interest in the farm throughout the triumphs which awaited him in his school and college career. "You can't make that boy a farmer," said the grammar school wiseacre. "I'll be a farmer some day," said young Louis, "but a soldier first, as my father was before me. Uncle Roberts can carry on the farm without any help for many a long year yet. When he wants that, I'll come." The lad was bold, and knew his own mind, and went to speak it. He won his uncle over to his own way of thinking, where the schoolmaster might have advised in vain, and went to an army crammer in due course. Old Llewellyn Roberts showed no sign that he grudged the expense of the lad's education. Perhaps he was proud of his nephew's wit and industry, and the ease with which he held his own in sport as in study. But when Louis had once obtained his commission, his uncle, beyond providing him with his outfit and £50 in ready money, assisted him no further, holding that he was now a made man, who must earn his bread and live by his profession. The boy asked no more favours, sailed for India with a light heart and the highest hopes, and managed for a couple of years, by hook or by crook, to keep his head above water in spite of a too open-handed disposition. Now and then Jean received from him letters of financial despair, over which she wept, for she had not a penny of her own in the world, and was powerless to help him. But when the South African War broke out, and Louis, who had been coming home with his regiment in the spring, was ordered to the front, he wrote joyfully to Jean, "I wonder how many poor fellows this war has saved from bankruptcy. Me, for one." Llewellyn Roberts was a sturdy, independent man, and had sought no assistance in the bringing up of his orphan nephew and niece from their father's relatives. Nevertheless, He was too shrewd a Welshman to refuse the tardy hand of fellowship held out by their wealthy and presumably dying great-aunt. On receipt of Miss Mamey's telegram, he had desired his niece to pack up immediately and go to London, and to stay as long as she was wanted. Girls did not enter much into the calculations of Uncle Roberts. He was a man of few words and fewer promises, and though he made no secret of his intention that Louise should inherit Coelho, he never talked of making any provision for Jean. If her great-aunt left her a legacy, however, so much the better for her. Whether she did or no, Jean was a pretty girl, and would probably get married some day. Uncle Roberts did not pause to consider that Jean had scarcely seen, much less spoken to a marriageable young man in her life. If she did not marry, it would be her brother's obvious duty to keep her. He did not trouble himself concerning Jean, though he liked in a vague way to know she was about the place. A timid, bright-eyed, dimpled young thing, always happy and occupied, it seemed to him, with her own harmless concerns into which he had no wish to pry. He left her entirely to the care and under the orders of old Granny Morgan, the woman who kept house for him, and who still looked upon Jean as a little girl, though she was 25 years old. Nor did Jean receive overmuch consideration at the rectory, whither she was perpetually invited or sent for to play with the solitary daughter of the house, some 2 years her senior, because Cecilia required a playmate, and Jean was gentle, good-tempered, and refined in speech and manner, being quick to observe and to imitate all that appealed to her natural taste, and to discard what did not. She learnt her first lessons in the village school, which was more than 2 miles distant from Coelho, and a long tramp for a little maid in bad weather. Here she got on so fast that her uncle was minded to send her to a genteel boarding school, being well-to-do. But he was happily deterred from this course by the rector's wife, who was not, and who saw her way to half the salary of a governess, and obtained a companion for her child at one and the same time. Louis privately rejoiced over this arrangement, whilst pretending to scorn Jean's studies and her friendship for the spoiled Cecilia. He found fault with her, teased her, and commanded her, after the fashion of brothers, while she worshipped him untiringly, excused his faults, and bore patiently with his moods, though often winking away a tear in secret, after the fashion of sisters. The twins loved each other so intensely that they were obliged to hide their feelings, each from each, for fear the other should discover the truth. Jean, of course, concealed her affection less carefully than Louis, wept openly when he went to school, and even seized the opportunity to be personally demonstrative whenever he was, from any cause too dejected to resent being kissed, or to be annoyed with her for thus dragging to the surface feelings which should have been too deep for outward expression. She reproached him sometimes for unkindness when he declined her offered caresses, but secretly she thought him a very manly boy. Though Louis indulged far less in romantic daydreams than did his solitary sister, yet he treasured the few records of his family's past greatness no less jealously than he. Though his prejudices as a British schoolboy warred with his sympathy for France, yet he had the history of that country at his fingers' ends, and kept steadily in view his determination to perfect himself in the language of his fathers. As he grew older, his perception widened with his reading, and he found it possible to combine loyalty for the land of his adoption with reverence for the misfortunes of his own race. At Sandhurst it was the fashion among his comrades to encourage young de Courset to hold forth upon the tragedy which must ensue in case war broke out between England and France. His intentions hovered between a dramatic resignation of his sword and immediate suicide, and the cadets warmly advocated the latter course, and supplied him with innumerable receipts for a painless end. Their derision was of a friendly kind, however, for Louis was popular, amusing, and sincere. It is affection which usually excites the ridicule that kills, and is the unforgivable sin most utterly detested by honest youth. From the time of his first school-going, Louis lived but little at the farm, and as he was not infrequently invited to pass a portion of his holidays with one schoolfellow or another, he had many friends of whom his sister knew next to nothing, and lived a life altogether separated from hers. But she enjoyed all his confidence, exulted in his successes, and sympathized passionately with his troubles. Perhaps she was less impressed with his wisdom than Louise always liked, for her rustic shyness and ignorance born of utter inexperience made him appear and feel much older than his twin sister. She thought him careless and extravagant, as indeed he was, and sent him little sermons concerning these tendencies. Sometimes her advice was more humorous than practical. "I am so sorry you do not like your C.O. He must be horrid, but do try hard, my dearest boy, to please him. For instance, you are so quick and clever. Could you not get up early and do all his work for him sometimes? I feel sure this would be the way to get on, and when they saw how much better you did it than he could, surely they would promote you. And please do send me your socks to mend. I am sure it would pay for the postage to get them properly done." But if Louis laughed over these and other effusions from the anxious little sister, his laughter was always tender. Her only confidante and the humble sharer of her hopes and her fears for her brother was Granny Morgan, and these letters were often the upshot of their consultations. "It is so difficult to know how to say enough and not too much," she would explain to the old woman, "but it frightens me to hear of these subscriptions and things when he has no money. A word here and a word there, my dearie, like water dropping on a stone," said Granny Morgan. "He'll take to counting his clothes when they comes home from the wash as he grows older, but the best of men is careless about such things. Just mix up a warning like in all the news you send him, like a powder in jam, and some of it will come home to him when he least expects it." Jean herself hardly knew the meaning of extravagance or self-indulgence. She grew up hard-working and simple, red-cheeked and bright-eyed, an adept in bee-keeping and fruit-preserving and butter-making. Though being the farmer's niece, she naturally left the milking of the cows to the herdsman, nor would old Morgan permit her to put her hand to any of the rougher work of the house, but prided herself on bringing up Jean like a lady, to sew her seam and look after the dairy. Nevertheless, Jean had her troubles, for though the rector and his wife were kind and homely, she was of little account in their eyes compared with their own overindulged daughter. Cecilia, in consequence, gave herself airs, and being older and bolder than her humble playmate, constantly asserted and maintained her superiority, until she electrified her little world by marrying, at 18, a celebrated scientist and archaeologist, who had come to this out-of-the-way corner of Wales in order to examine the ruins for which it was famous. The professor's spectacled and middle-aged eyes lit upon the rector's daughter, and her apple-cheeked, fair-haired, buxom comeliness inclined him to wed Cecilia. Her parents never dreamed of her accepting his proposal, but she did so, and it turned out that he was rich, and she became very superior and prosperous on the spot. Thus she passed out of Jean's life, and very nearly out of her parents' lives also, who had existed since her birth only for her, and who were equally pained and bewildered by this unforeseen result of her promotion. Jean, though she had not at the same time much regretted the departure of Cecilia, had certainly missed her, since the fitful semblance of friendship had been kept up between them to the last. For a few months after the wedding, a desultory correspondence was maintained. Then Mrs. Hogg Watson became too busy or too magnificent to write any more to her humble friend at Coed Ithel Farm. "I think the child is honest, Dunham. I'm sure of it, ma'am. Her eyes remind me of Clumber. You remember Clumber?" "Yes, ma'am," said Dunham, with an infection of disapproval. "But I would be sorry to compare a Christian for a dog, ma'am." "Nevertheless, she has the same brown faithful eyes as my dear old spaniel." Dunham permitted herself a slight sniff. "And though she appears self-engrossed, as all young people do, she is not really thinking of herself at all, but of her brother. She is on the watch, as Clumber used to be for me, jealously guarding him all the while, though he is so far away. My heart went out to her, Dunham, for she's my own kith and kin after all. She is so gentle and so faithful, not at all the vulgar young woman I had dreaded. "She is too simple to be vulgar, ma'am," said Dunham shrewdly. "She is very rustic and timid, of course." "So she is, ma'am. Almost afraid to eat and drink, Hewitt says. I desire you will not repeat the servants' gossip about my grandniece, Dunham. I am very glad to hear she has not a gross appetite. It would be lamentable in so young a person. What else does he say of her?" "I think, ma'am, you'll tire yourself with talking too much," said Dunham stiffly. "You are taking advantage to bully me, Dunham, because you think me too ill to resent it," said the invalid, querulously. "Me take advantage? God forbid you for saying so, Miss Caroline. But you don't mean it, and it's time for your mixture." A tear shone in the old blue eyes. "Perhaps I am a little tired," said Miss Mamey, "though I waited several days before sending for her. I wouldn't let her come till I felt quite myself again." Then after a pause, "They seem to have taken a great care of their French family rubbish, such as it is, all these years, Dunham. They must be worthy of trust." "I'm one as judges by small things, ma'am, and I'm sure of it. She's not so much as thrown a burnt match about since she's been here. Never a chair moved out of its place in the morning room but it's put back, and the new ormolu fender hasn't another mark on it since the day the curate called and balanced hisself on the edge of it, all the time he was asking you for a subscription." "Yes, I looked up the bill for the fender, and deducted the amount from the sum I had intended to give," said Miss Mamey grimly. "I am glad she is careful of the furniture. It confirms my good opinion. Dunham, I am half thinking of sending for Mr. Valentine to morrow." "I've no opinion of half thoughts, ma'am. They generally come to nothing. You will write him a line to night," said Miss Caroline. Jeanne sat over the fire with the miniatures in her lap, when Dunham came tapping at the door. "A letter for you, missy, from South Africa. I thought I would bring it myself, and hear how the young gentleman was." "How very kind of you." Jeanne's eyes opened in grateful astonishment at this sudden access of attentiveness. "I've seen his photograph, missy," said Dunham in subdued tones, betraying, however, that note of personal interest which had hitherto been entirely lacking in her brief converse with Jeanne. "Did Aunt Marnie, I mean Aunt Caroline, show it to you?" "Yes, missy, she did." "You have lived with her a long, long time, Mrs. Dunham, haven't you?" "Yes, missy. You'll be wanting to look at your letter." Jeanne opened it reluctantly. She preferred reading those sacred epistles from her far away soldier in solitude, a page at a time, to eke out her delight. But the first glance at the closely written sheets caused her to utter an incredulous sound of delight and surprise. "Oh, Mrs. Dunham, his passage is booked. He is coming home. He will sail by the Briton early in January, or at least he hopes he will." She forgot her desire for solitude in the joy of sharing the good news. "I'm very glad, missy." Dunham's voice was troubled. "I don't know if I ought to take it on myself, but if you could send him a cable and ask him to start earlier." "Earlier? But I never expected him to come at all." Dunham hesitated. Her small dim eyes peered anxiously out of her wrinkled face. "Your auntie would like to see him." "But she will see him." Dunham shook her head sorrowfully. "I am sure you are over anxious, Mrs. Dunham," said Jeanne, who now beheld all the world through rose-coloured spectacles. "Indeed, indeed, she does not seem to me so very ill." Dunham evaded the subject. "It might make a great difference, missy, to the young gentleman," she urged beneath her breath. "A great difference," said Jeanne. But though she was simple she was not stupid. A light broke in upon her. "Oh, you could not suppose he would hurry home for that?" she cried in horror. It is sometimes difficult for the old to fathom the disinterestedness, the lofty sentiment of the very young. But Dunham did not make the mistake of doubting Jeanne's sincerity. "He is so like the old Colonel, Miss Jane," she said earnestly, "that your auntie can think of nothing else. When she wasn't talking to me, she's lain there, looking at the photograph, like one in a dream. She was terrible wrapped up in her papa, missy, and that picture in the morning room is the apple of her eye. It was a thousand pities the young gentleman didn't walk in to see her before he started for the war. But, Mrs. Dunham, we did not even know where she lived. It is more than 25 years ago that my father broke with his mother's people. They were never in our lives at all. I know, missy, and more's the pity, for the young gentleman is a Marnie, every inch of him, as his auntie keeps saying. He is a de Courset, said Jean, and her cheeks burnt. Not in looks, Miss Jane, as you could not deny, if you remembered your own father as I do, said the maid with asperity. Oh, Mrs. Dunham, do you indeed? Please tell me about him, cried Jean, and she dropped her dignified manner in haste. Uncle Roberts never speaks of him. He tells us nothing. We are told to speak no ill of the dead, Miss Jane, said Dunham. If your poor papa didn't turn out as steady a young gentleman as his best friends would have wished. Why, he died for his country, missy, as no man can do more. And in the grave, as they say, all is forgotten. I can't stop, for your auntie doesn't like me out of her sight. But if you could only think over, without a word to your auntie, about cabling to Mr. Louis. The name came naturally to her lips. You needn't to give him any reason, but just to say that it was best for him to come. Oh, Mrs. Dunham, Louis and I have no secrets from each other. Of course, if I cabled for him, I must tell him why. And though he loves me more than any one else in the whole world, said Jean, and her tone was jealously exultant, and would do what I asked him if he possibly could, yet his work comes first. A soldier must think of his duty, you know, and his whole career besides depends on it. I am perfectly certain he could not get away earlier. All his letters are full of his longing to get home. Just think that he has not seen England for 5 years, nor me, his only sister and his twin, and you can imagine that if he could get away a single day sooner, he would be only too glad to do it. Poor young gentleman, he must have had a hard time. But he's got on well, by all accounts, and been steady, missy, I hope, said Dunham, lingering. Steady? Why, he has done brilliantly, cried Jean with soft indignation. She seized the chance of holding forth upon her brother's perfections the more eagerly, because she had had no listener for 3 weeks, and also because, like many young people, she was, at this period of her life, most exclusively interested in her own concerns. Just think of him, Mrs. Dunham, a poor young lieutenant in a line regiment with nothing but his pay, and now he is a captain at 25 and has the D.S.O. He wasn't even very glad at his promotion, for so many of his regiment were killed, poor fellows, and he always thought that was so like Louis, that they were better men than he. He said the best always got shot. It was like a fatality. But Louis came through it all without a scratch, and he was mentioned in dispatches twice, Mrs. Dunham. He was indeed. Uncle Roberts pretended not to care, but he cried, he actually cried, when the rector came up with the paper, and his colonel wrote about him to Uncle Llewellyn, though Louis couldn't bear him when first he joined, but on active service he said it was all different. And when the war was over, he got his job at Durban about the prisoners of war, partly because he learned Dutch so quickly that he spoke it quite well, and of course it gave him extra pay, but it was all through his own cleverness, for he has no interest, Mrs. Dunham, none whatever. He's got it in his face, missy, said Dunham in the same subdued tones, but still I'm sorry, very sorry I am, that he couldn't be here for your auntie's last Christmas. Does the doctor say that? Said Jean, startled. Oh, missy, I go by my own senses. That's known her 50 years. Far better than any doctor, said Dunham. A professional gentleman knows better than to make prophecies and risk being wrong after all. His patients want to be told that they must do to get well again. It's not his business, not yet his interest, to tell them that they won't never get well, to bid them give over hoping. Does Aunt Caroline know? Yes, missy, said Dunham solemnly. She knows as well as I do. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Ruhi Haq. The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square by Mrs. Henry Dilla Pasture. Chapter 4. The Funeral. Jean sat in the London church as one in a dream. Through the fog which pervaded the building, the lights twinkled mistily, and a faraway voice pronounced the words of the burial service so slowly that her tired and bewildered brain could not follow the sentences consecutively. Her attention fixed itself upon the coffin, heaped with flowers, its shape dimly visible among the surrounding bearers, and her mind was filled with a vague, wild pity for the unconscious occupant, upon whose waxen face she had gazed for the last time on the previous day. The old servants, a small, pathetic, black-clad group, with bent shoulders and whitened heads, were together in a pew on the left, and the rest of the household a little lower down the church. But Jean on the right knelt in her pew alone, and of other mourners, save the lawyer and the doctor, there were none. How strange that a woman so wealthy should have so few friends, thought little Jean. The tears fell fast upon her new black crape. Just as I was beginning to love her, she thought, and now she will never see Louis after all. That a thing so much desired should not come to pass seemed incredibly sad and astonishing to her. If Jean had heard at Coed of Miss Mamey's death in London at 80 years old, and after a succession of paralytic seizures, it would have presented itself to her mind as a most likely and natural event. But as it had actually occurred, it seemed to her for the moment almost as though the end of the world had come. She could hardly even realize it to be true. During the long days that had elapsed between her aunt's death and the funeral, she had gone over and over the past weeks incessantly in her own mind, and lived through the final tragedy 100 times, always possessed by a horror and a pity in proportion to her utter inexperience. She lay awake in her isolated chamber with beating heart, hearing again and again the flying footsteps in the echoing corridors, the hurried summons at the door, the silver chiming of the clock in the silent chamber of death, the sound of that deep, deep breathing that would presently cease forever. But when she recalled her third and last interview with Miss Caroline, she could not but own to herself that her aunt had spoken then much as she might have spoken had she expected to live for another 100 years. The habits of a lifetime do not change in a moment, even though that moment be the last. The little growling dog was caressed. The gloved hand still guarded the velvet bag as jealously as though Miss Caroline meant to take it with her on her long journey. She was still anxious to impress upon Jean the importance of the Marnies of Orsett and the comparative insignificance of the de Coursets. She referred to the advantages of exclusiveness, and emphasized the necessity for taking care of the furniture and the pictures. Was it possible she could be so near eternity, and her mind yet fixed so firmly on things which would presently for her have no existence at all? No more sincere and pitiful mourner than little Jean could have knelt by that deathbed of her old relation, and yet the emotion which possessed her was but the shadow of sorrow, and not sorrow itself, though it held much of regret. Very strongly she felt that she might have loved Miss Caroline had she known her a little better. An instinctive sympathy had immediately manifested itself between her and her aunt, but it had come too late. Miss Mamey had passed the last years of her long life in solitude, whilst Jean, not much less lonely than her aunt, since she had lost the companionship of Louis, would so gladly have borne her company, and given her the affection of a dutiful and gentle child. Dunham, jealously watching her poor lady's great niece, though convinced of her sincerity, was touched by the anxiety Jean manifested to learn what her aunt's wishes had been, that she might be certain of acting in accordance with them throughout those dismal days. "The directions for her funeral were all written long ago, ma'am," said Durham, whose respect for Jean increased now that she had beheld in her the sole representative present of the family she had served so long. "She is to be laid by the side of poor Mr. Philip, ma'am, in the family vault. No, ma'am, she would not have liked you to travel down with it. She had very fixed ideas about what ladies were able to do. Mr. Valentine and the doctor will go, and there'll be some of the old people left down there. They'll be present, ma'am, you may depend. You will go to the church, Miss Jane," and she was particular as it should be the one she last attended. She was always chopping and changing, poor dear, according as the services went up or down, or didn't suit her fancy one way and another. "You'll go to the church with the rest of us, and then there's nothing more to be done, ma'am, but to wait till Mr. Valentine, the lawyer, comes and tells you what's been settled." So the sad procession wended its way from the church to the station, and the men went with it. But Jean, with Dunham and Mrs. Pyke in attendance, returned to the desolate house in Grosvenor Square, where she strove to fulfil the remaining hours of the day by writing a long letter to her brother. "Oh, Louis, it is so dreadful. The great house was silent enough before, but now that she is really gone, it seems 1,000 times more empty still. Reason as one may, how cruel it feels to take her out of her beautiful luxurious room, away from all the comforts that have always surrounded her poor body, away from all the familiar things she has treasured so long, and just lay her in a cold stone vault. I know it has to come to everybody, but it is freshly awful when it comes home to one's self like this. But you have seen death so often and so close, poor boy, that you will hardly understand my feeling. I say to myself, but what is one old woman whose life was finished, to all the young lives that have been cut short in the South African War? And yet perhaps because I am alone, and you so far away, perhaps because this house and everyone in it is still so strange to me, I cannot get over the horror of it, nor the remembrance of it, and am so cowardly and afraid at night. I try to remember all she said the last morning when I saw her by daylight for the first time, and realized that she was really very ill. I am glad to recollect she said she was pleased I had come, and that she wished it had been earlier. But I can't say she was at all like what I expected a dying person to be, even then. She said Providence played odd tricks in rather a complaining way, not at all as though it were in any way her own doing, poor dear, not to have sent for me earlier. She spoke of you and asked about your career, and praised you for having done so well, though brought up in an out-of-the-way form, with nothing to inspire you but your own ambition, and said how it proved that blood will always tell, but she meant the blood of the Marneys and not of the de Cossets all the time. She hoped you were very particular what company you kept, she said, and it was bad company which led thoughtless young men astray, and oh, I am afraid she was thinking of poor papa. But you would never, never be led astray, would you, Louis, or fall into the evil ways she spoke of? I told her again and again that you have never done anything in your life that you ought not to do, and that at the worst you were only a very little extravagant in giving presents and things you could not afford. I think I comforted her, and she said extravagance didn't matter. But oh, Louis, that is only because she is so rich. She doesn't know what poverty means, so don't let it lead you astray, to hear she thinks so little of it. About me she said she was glad to see I was so very exclusive, which is I think her polite way of noticing that I have no friends at all, and she liked to think of me in the morning room, because Dunham told her how very careful I was of the furniture. I should hope so. You have no idea how beautiful it is. Again and again she begged me to take care of her things, as though I were going to live here all my life, as it was a mistake to trust the best of servants, and that she liked to know I had a brother so devoted to me as hers had always been to her, and that history repeated itself. Well, then Dunham came in and said Mr. Valentine had called, and Aunt Caroline said he was to come up at once to her room. I thought she seemed a little depressed, so I foolishly said how glad I was she had a visitor, and I hoped it would cheer her a little. She quite drew her head up on the pillow, and said solicitors were not visitors, and that he had come on business. Professional callers, even though they may be gentlemen, my dear Jane, do not count. But of course you could not know that, my love. I went away directly he came in, but I thought he looked a kind old man. Mrs. Dunham says he and his father and grandfather have been the Marneys' solicitors for 3 generations, and have always known all their affairs. When I think over that last interview, all we said seems rather meaningless and trivial. If I had known she was going, I would have liked just to thank her for sending for me, and to tell her that I was very proud to belong to her, for she was an ideal old lady to look at, and you would have been proud of her too. Besides, I might have told her that we would both remember her loyally always, and other things which would have pleased and comforted her, and yet been quite true. But no, instead of all this, I sat still and was more anxious to talk about you than to listen to the last words she was ever going to say to me in this world. During those long hours when we were all waiting through the night, waiting, oh how dreadful through the night, for her to die, she spoke only twice, almost as though in her sleep. Once she said, "The horse chestnuts are coming out in the avenue." I felt that her spirit was a long way off in the past, back at Orsett in the country, the springtime and the sunshine. The next time it would have been funny if it had not been so terribly pathetic, for she said, half crying, "Mary Ann is very cross. She won't let me go to the fair." So then she must have been a little girl again. I hope she died like that, and did not go away in the dark, thinking of herself as an old woman, with nobody but Mrs. Dunham and Mrs. Pike left behind to be sorry for her. Your photo was under her pillow, so I have got it back again at last. I wish I hadn't grudged it to her so much. It was all like a dream afterwards. I shook hands with 1 or 2 people, but I scarcely know who they were. One was the doctor, but neither he nor the parson seemed to know her at all well. Mrs. Dunham said she didn't believe in doctors, and changed her church very often. The poor curate evidently did not know exactly what to say, but I suppose he thought he ought to try and comfort me, so he said, "God be wi' ye," instead of "goodbye," in a hollow voice, and squeezed my hand so viciously that my ring cut into my finger. I was horrified with myself for feeling more inclined to laugh than to cry, when I am sure he meant so kindly. But when he asked if I was staying on, I explained I should be going back to Coedithel in a few days, so I don't think he'll come again. I wrote to Uncle Roberts and told him when it was all over, and he sent a postcard to say it was the decree of Providence, and what we must all come to. But he evidently had no idea of coming up for the funeral, as the doctor thought he might, and as I was sure he wouldn't. I am writing this in the morning room, and I will finish it tomorrow when I have seen Mr. Valentine. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Ruhi Haq. The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square by Mrs. Henry de la Pasture. Chapter 5. The Will. A gleam of wintry sunshine stole in through the lace-shrouded windows, and turned the green damask walls of the morning room to gold, and brightened the flowered chintz on the couch, and shone through the ragged petals of the giant lemon-tinted and copper-hued chrysanthemums, and upon the fresh dark violets in their silver bowl. Before an old French bureau, Mr. Valentine sat with crossed knees and folded hands, explaining the late Miss Mamey's wishes to her grandniece. He was not at all like Jeanne's preconceived notion of a family solicitor, being neither dried up nor severe, but on the contrary a very pleasant, cheerful, grey-headed old gentleman, with an expression which, subdue it as he would, was jovial in the extreme. "This will was executed somewhat hurriedly," he said, "but it is of course quite in order, and I am heartily glad, if you will allow me to say so, to have been enabled even at the last moment to assist poor Miss Mamey to do justice to her only surviving relatives. I am afraid the charities would be somewhat annoyed with me if they knew what they had lost. Happily they never will, since she destroyed her former testament." Here he showed a faint inclination to chuckle, but was restored instantly to professional gravity by the alarm on Jeanne's expressive face. You don't mean it is depriving anyone? Certainly not. Good heavens, no, my dear young lady, said the lawyer, wishing he had been less frank. Pray dismiss any such idea from your mind. Your brother is actually poor Miss Mamey's next of kin. He has every possible natural and legal right to inherit her money. If there is anything to be said in the matter, it is on your own account. You have an equal claim upon your great aunt with your brother, and she has ignored you altogether. Mr. Valentine, said Jeanne very earnestly, I promise you faithfully that I would much rather it all belonged to Louis. What is his is mine, and what is mine is his. It is really exactly the same thing. If you knew him, her pause was more eloquent than the most fervent praise, you would understand. I hope I may know him very soon indeed, said Mr. Valentine. The twinkling eyes beneath grey brows bent a kind gaze upon Jeanne, and she looked up at him with sincere veneration. Your brother is of age, I believe. He is 25, and he is a captain already, said Jeanne, trembling with anxiety to recapitulate her brother's extraordinary achievements. He has been very lucky. He saw some service on the Indian frontier, and he has been through the South African War without a scratch. Twice he was mentioned in dispatches, and they have given him a job at Durban, which he says will be a most good thing for his career, simply because he learnt Dutch so well, or on his own merits, for he has no interest, Mr. Valentine, none whatever. Unless perhaps they remembered that his father and his grandfather were both killed in action, one at Sevastopol and one in Afghanistan. Most creditable, I am sure, said Mr. Valentine, encouragingly, as she paused for breath. But I haven't seen him for 5 years, though I am his twin sister, she said, rather mournfully. Do you mean to say you are 25? I am always taken for younger. It is annoying, she said, abashed by his genuine astonishment. Mr. Valentine looked at the round, childish, wistful face, with its bright eyes and red bloom of health, and smiled. He would have laughed, but for the solemnity of the occasion. Most people would be anything but annoyed. I am afraid you would not be particularly surprised if I told you I was 65. No, I should not, said honest Jeanne, very simply. And yet I am only 58, said Mr. Valentine rather ruefully. But, however, to return to business, I must apologise for all my elaborate explanations. But you see, I had fancied myself talking to a young lady just out of the schoolroom. The explanation made everything clear, said Jeanne, and I do not suppose I know much more of these things than a young lady just out of the schoolroom would, for I have no experience at all, as Louis says. I have just lived all my life in the same place, a very lonely place in the country, with my uncle, who is a farmer. Then may I be permitted to ask what you will do now? If this house belongs to Louis, but indeed it seems hardly to be believed. It is undoubtedly your brother's house. Then I must stay here till he comes home, and take care of it for him, said Jeanne decidedly. Aunt Caroline said it was very wrong to leave even the best of servants to look after valuable pictures and furniture alone. I am quite sure you are right, but I fear you will have a lonely Christmas unless, but no doubt you will persuade some friend to come and be with you. She shook her head. No, there is nobody. But I shall be thinking of Louis, you know, for his coming home so soon. She put her hand to her brow, which ached from the emotion of the previous day, and added with a bewildered look, I hope it is not heartless, but doesn't it all mean that Louis will be very rich? He will be a very rich man indeed, said Mr. Valentine gently. Jeanne sat for a moment in silence. Her heart throbbed. She thought of Louis struggling to live on his pay, of the little presents he had sent her home which he could so ill afford, and which made her cry and laugh over his loving and foolish extravagance, of the letters she had written to beseech him to be just before he was generous, which was exactly what Louis could never be, and had never been, of the many, many things he had wanted, and which she had implored him to do without, and wept because she could not send them, and because Uncle Roberts, for all his substantial goodness, was not a man to be asked for money. The tears dropped once more from her brown eyes, and she just breathed the words, I wish I could have thanked Aunt Caroline as she wiped them away. "You are quite sure that it is all right, and that there can be no mistake? It would be so cruel to raise his hopes and then find, after all, there was nothing. Would it not be safer to make certain before we say anything about it to him?" "It is quite right, and safe as the Bank of England," said Mr. Valentine soothingly. "Everything Miss Mamey has in the world is left unconditionally to your brother. He and I are joint executors, and we are directed to divide a certain sum among the old servants. That is literally all. The picture, the Rumney, this room, actually belongs to Louis. I beg your pardon, Mr. Valentine, but the more I think of it, the less I can believe it." "You will get used to the idea," said Mr. Valentine. "Now, if you will give me your brother's address, we will write to him at once." Jeanne dictated the address, and watched him write it down. "Pray understand," he said as he did so, "that I am at your service in every possible way until your brother comes home. I hope you will refer any matter of business connected with this sad event directly to myself." "I shall be very thankful, for I know nothing of business," said Jeanne, timidly. "I suppose everything can go on here as usual. I am sure Aunt Caroline would not have liked any changes, and Louis would want to respect her wishes, I know." "Your brother is coming home so soon that I should certainly advise no changes until his return," said Mr. Valentine. "If any difficulty arises in the matter of immediate expenses, we shall only be too happy to—" "Oh, there can be none," said Jeanne, and her eyes filled with tears, for poor Aunt Caroline kept a large sum of ready money in her velvet bag, always by her side. Mrs. Dunham was so upset trying to get it away from the little dog. He would not let it go, but she said Aunt Caroline had desired her to give it to me, and she counted the notes for me, and wrote down the numbers. She said an account must be kept of them. There were 6 £25 notes, and Aunt Caroline gave me 2 the other day." "It will certainly not be necessary to keep an account of your aunt's presents to yourself," said Mr. Valentine courteously, "and I am afraid you would not find that £150 would go very far towards maintaining this great house. The expenses will of course be defrayed from the state. You must not think of infringing on your aunt's small gift. I am sure your brother would not wish it, the more especially since he certainly owes his inheritance indirectly to you, for poor Miss Mamey made no secret of the fact that her acquaintance with you inspired her to make this very satisfactory change in the disposition of her property. Now we are agreed that everything should continue as usual here until Captain de Courset's return, or until we receive instructions from him to the contrary. We will ask him to cable his wishes on receipt of our communication." "I know very well what his wishes will be," said Jeanne. Happiness dawned once more in her shy brown eyes at the thought of her brother's return, and his return to such amazing and unexpected prosperity. "I cannot realise what it will be like to see him again after all these years. First India, then this long South African time, and now in a few weeks he will be with me again. I am expecting a telegram directly. He knows for certain which ship he will sail by. Oh, I wonder if he will have changed very much." Mr. Valentine was very kind and sympathetic, and had every desire to please his new client, or his new client's sister, but he was a very busy man, and the Christmas holidays were fast approaching; wherefore he did not invite Jeanne to return to the discussion of her brother's personality or his adventures, but after a repetition of the subdued congratulations proper to the occasion, shook hands with her, and bowed himself out. Jeanne, left alone, looked round the warm luxurious room, at the little table covered with trifles become pathetic through the death of their owner, the silver handled loup that the dead woman had used for reading the newspapers, the gold topped flask of scent, the cut glass bottle of salts, the turquoise studded bonbonniere and tortoise shell paper knife, all of which had been restored to their original places by the careful Dunham, when they were no longer needed in the sick room. An immense fire glowed on the hearth. The air was pervaded by the sweet breath of the scented violets. The young life in her heart beat more strongly for the rebound from its mournful contact with death. She had not seen the sunshine for so long. Suddenly Jeanne fell on her knees beside the violets, and cried out, almost involuntarily, "Oh, thank you, thank you, to relieve her overcharged heart, and without any very clear idea as to whether she was addressing the Almighty or poor Miss Caroline. Was Louis to be delivered from his stress of poverty and gain his heart's desire, the means which would enable him to rise to any position he chose, given his industry and talents, and all his personal advantages to supplement his wealth? To restore, perhaps, the ancient dignity of his family, and fulfil their childish dreams, and all this through the unconscious agency of his humble, ignorant, devoted sister. This was the mouse aiding the lion indeed. Her heart swelled at the proud thought. But it wasn't really me, thought little Jean, whatever the lawyer may suppose. It was the photograph. It was his dear face which made her feel she must do Louis justice, far more than any words of mine. It was the likeness to you, Colonel Harry. And she looked up at the handsome, disdainful face of Harry Mamey, whose boyhood, perpetuated by a master hand, was as fresh to day as it had been 100 years since. "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you," murmured Jeanne, and she dropped her face into her hands for a moment in a silent passion of gratitude before rising from her knees. How bright the room looked! Poor Aunt Caroline! An heartless cheerful lady's bower, which the dead brain had planned, and the dead hand created and filled, however incongruously, with beautiful and pleasant things. Those long weeks of absolute solitude had brought the lonely lady into an almost unnatural relation with inanimate things. The furniture, the pictures, and the flowers seemed not to be soulless, but eloquent witnesses of past sadness, and now, with herself, eagerly expectant of joy to come. She went round, softly touching one thing and another. The strangeness of the house had vanished, and only its beauty remained. It was Louis's house. She might ask for the keys of the locked Chickendale bookcases when she would. They were Louis's books. The treasures she had feared to touch, were they not almost her own, since they belonged to Louis? It was no longer even so much Miss Caroline's father, who looked sternly forth from his golden frame above the glowing hearth, but Louis's great grandfather, watching over his descendants' lawful inheritance. In 3 weeks, 3 little weeks, Louis would come to his own. His bedroom must be chosen. How the replenishing of it would help to pass the time. Already one half of Miss Mamey's original gift of bank notes to her niece had travelled to South Africa. It would be a great sum to Louis, almost as great and wonderful a windfall as it had been to Jeanne, the prudent little sister who had, after anxious reflection, decided to send only the one note to her brother, and to say nothing of the other, but reserve it for emergencies. Now no such emergencies need be feared. The £25 could be spent upon the preparations she would make for her hero's return. She wondered whether Mrs. Dunham would think it heartless if she rang the bell, and asked for her advice in choosing her brother's room now. She thought not, for Dunham had already, and with a ring of sad exultation in her grief subdued voice, referred to the home coming of the young gentleman. Miss Caroline had had few secrets from her faithful waiting woman, and the contents of the will, which had surprised Jeanne so much, had been perfectly well known to Dunham, though she had discreetly held her peace upon the subject. As Jeanne hesitated with her hand on the bell, Hewitt entered with a telegram upon a salver. He presented it to his young lady with the air of increased respect which all the household had exhibited since the death of their late mistress. Jeanne took it eagerly. Her heart was so full that she was inclined to be communicative even with the monumental butler. The receipt of a telegram, besides, was not an everyday occurrence with her, but a rare and exciting event. "Oh, thank you, Hewitt. I expect it is from my brother," she said, breathlessly opening it, "to tell me the ship by which he is to come home." Her voice died away as she read the telegram, once uncomprehendingly, and the second time with a full realisation of its purport. The brightness faded from her eyes, and the red colour from her cheeks, for these were the words of the message Louis had sent: "Ordered Somaliland. Embark Durban 7th January." End of chapter 5.